So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here for another Voices with Vervaeke. I've had several off-camera conversations with Bishop Maximus, and I've found them deeply rich conversations. And I was moved to invite the bishop to come on and do a Voices with Vervaeke with me. So welcome, Bishop Maximus. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you reached out to me and so forth?
Well, thank you very much, John, for having me on your podcast. It's really an honor and a pleasure. And I've been engaging with your work and enjoying your work for maybe a year now. So my name is Bishop Maximus. I'm a traditionalist Greek Orthodox bishop. I was born in the United States, but I'm responsible for some Orthodox missions in Latin America and also in Africa. I live in Guatemala in the Hermitage of St. Ignatius. It's a small Orthodox monastery in the mountains, and it's a Spanish-speaking monastery. I also teach a couple of philosophy courses in the Orthodox Seminary named SPOTS, that's St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary. That's in Etna, California. The classes that I teach there have, I think, a little bit of relationship to what your work is, John. One of them is called Science and Religion, and it's about the relationship between the two, both historically and philosophically. And the other, in spite of having the boring name of philosophy too, is actually about the way that ancient Greek philosophy was engaged with by the Christian church, specifically on the one hand by the Eastern Fathers in one fashion, and on the other hand in the West, the way it developed in scholasticism. So these are a couple of courses that I teach, which I think have some connection with your work. Like many people, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I discovered you through your podcast with Jordan Peterson, the one you had a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. And you know, when I saw it, I was very impressed with what you were saying, and so I decided to look you up, and I found well, you have quite a few lectures, and so I went through your whole flagship lecture of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I found it very very useful. I found that some of your categories and ways of conceiving ideas were useful, even within the Orthodox Christian context. And so I have tried to integrate those into the way that I think. So, for example, your 4 different types of knowledge that you outline, or the idea of relevant realization, which maybe I had conceived of in some other terms in an inchoate fashion, but I think you've done some good work in unpacking it and putting it on a sound psychological and even scientific basis, which I think is really useful. So I think that your work is very good. Obviously, there's some points that I don't agree on, yes. And some of those might be obvious to you. Obviously, the differences, the questions that are specifically Christian. Although maybe there's some other points that would be a little bit less obvious. And also, I think that what's important about your work is not only the ideas that you present and the research that you do, but the good spirit that you have to engage with other people and to try to bring a spirit of of peace and reconciliation and engagement, especially in our days where we're so polarized, we're so divided. And if we want to avoid some catastrophe, I really think that we need to approach each other in this Irenic spirit. And so in a sense, that part of your work, which is very much part of your public engagement, in a sense, that's as important as the actual content itself. So I want to thank you for both of those aspects, and I very much appreciate your willingness to speak with me, and I'm very happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Bishop. I'm encouraged by what you say. The manner of my interactions is as important to me as the material that I'm discussing or developing. So thank you for recognizing that. I aspire for that to always be the case, which is why I felt our conversations have carried that spirit very well. And I'd really be grateful for you to enter into it in that way. Now, in that spirit, I want you to pick up on that point you made about Neoplatonism being picked up differently in Eastern and Western Christianity, and what that might mean, first just sort of generally philosophically, but then more specifically, what might it mean in terms of the resources available to address the meaning crisis? Are there things that, for example, I've read a couple of people who have argued, and I'm not saying I agree, I'm just presenting it as an opportunity for you to use as a foil, but because Eastern Christianity didn't go through the same kind of history as Western Christianity, it might have resources for addressing the meaning crisis that are not so readily available in Western Christianity, or something to that effect. So that's sort of the context, but could you expand it as you see fit on the different ways in which Neoplatonism was taken up into Western and Eastern Christianity?
Mm-hmm. Well, that idea that Eastern Christianity or Eastern Orthodoxy has some resources that are less readily available in the Western traditions to help us get through the meaning crisis, I think that's almost a commonplace within modern Orthodox thinking.
Mm.
There's quite a bit of literature about that by modern Orthodox theologians. Some of it is pretty polemical, but I think there's a lot of talk about that in the modern Orthodox world. So if we go back to Neoplatonism, Christianity grew within the context of the Greco-Roman world.
Mm.
It started out, of course, on a simple and practical level, but it was inevitable that sooner or later it had to engage with ancient Greek philosophy, because that was the intellectual framework which existed at that time. It was an incredibly powerful intellectual tradition, which has validity and utility even to this day. Mm-hmm. It's not outdated, I would not say. Mm-hmm. And so as time went on, it became more and more apparent that there was a need to engage with it. And of course, there were different attitudes towards ancient Greek philosophy within the early Christian church. Tertullian said famously, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" Mm-hmm. That was, very much on one side of the equation. But there were others who had a more positive attitude. And by late antiquity, the ancient Greek philosophical tradition had, in a sense, coalesced into Neoplatonism. Mm-hmm. So Neoplatonism had this is a simplification, but I think it's a useful simplification. It had borrowed the ethics of Stoicism It had borrowed the logic and the physics of Aristotle, and then it had encapsulated it within a metaphysical framework of Platonism.
Mm.
And so it was, Neoplatonism was in a sense the fulfillment or the ultimate last step of ancient Greek philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so inevitably, that was primarily what the church was going to be engaging in. And the Eastern fathers of the church, who of course spoke Greek and were able to access the complete corpus of Neoplatonic thought, in contradistinction to what was available in the West, where only a tiny portion of ancient Greek philosophy had been translated into Latin. And there were some summaries and simplifications by Cicero, for example. The fact that in late antiquity, which was really the formative period, both for Neoplatonism and for Christian theology, the place where the most intense engagement was occurring was really the East,
Mm-hmm.
because that was the richer part of the empire. It was more heavily populated. The educational level was much higher, and there were universities of philosophy in a number of cities in the East, and none of this existed in the West, because the West was collapsing.
And as you also said, there's the shared language, Greek, and there's the more full access to a lot of the documents than there were in the West. So there's a considerable difference between the East's and the West's capacity to engage with Neoplatonism.
Yes, and inevitably that meant that the Western engagement was going to be, at least to some extent, truncated.
Mm-hmm.
At least until the scholastic period. Then once you get into the Middle Ages, the 12th century and the 13th century, you have a great deal of ancient Greek philosophy being translated into Latin. First in the 12th century from Arabic, and then in the 13th century, direct translations from Greek. So the Eastern fathers engaged with Neoplatonism in a way which I would characterize it, and I understand that it's a somewhat pretentious word, but I would characterize it as a transfiguration of Neoplatonism.
Right.
Now, when I say that, and I want to bracket anything that I'm going to say negatively about scholasticism with the fact that I think that if the Eastern fathers transfigured Neoplatonism or ancient Greek philosophy, I think we could say fairly that the scholastics perfected ancient Greek philosophy. In other words, within its own terms, they smoothed out a lot of wrinkles and they developed a lot of ideas further. So I have a lot of respect on a philosophical level for the scholastics. It's hard not to be impressed by the works of Thomas Aquinas.
Yes.
And I think that even in the modern context, it's very useful to study scholasticism. I think scholasticism can form a very good basis for understanding philosophy. It's a good starting point, and I would like to see more people studying scholasticism in some manner, and it's certainly a lot better than a lot of the philosophy programs that are going on in different schools, which tend towards postmodernism, or it's not really clear what they're doing with the philosophy. And there's a lot of modern Roman Catholic scholars who are, you could say, neo-scholastics that have written really excellent books, like Peter Kreeft, for example. I don't know if you've read any of his.
I've seen Peter Kreeft. I've read people like Clark, with the One and a Many and Explorations of Metaphysics, and Sebastian Morello, who argues that Aquinas should be better understood as a Neoplatonist than an Aristotelian.
Which I agree with, by the way.
Yes, yes. And Clark is,
and Gilson, for example.
Yes.
So there's a lot of very good, very serious philosophers, modern philosophers in the scholastic or neo-scholastic tradition, and I have tremendous respect for them, and I think their work is very useful, in spite of the fact that there are a number of core differences that distinguish the Eastern patristic tradition from the Western scholastic tradition.
So let's pick up the two qualifiers you used. You see the Western Christianity, perhaps typified in Aquinas, as perfecting Neoplatonism. And I think there's great merit to the idea that Neoplatonism, the Christian Neoplatonism, is in some sense superior to pagan Neoplatonism. And then you've got Eastern Christianity, like perhaps typified by somebody like Maximus.
Maximus and Dionysius.
Yeah, Maximus and Dionysius, yes, for sure. And then you said that was that transfigured. So now could you tease out what the difference between those are? Perfection, and I get it that I want to just be clear, because people who don't know much, have much Greek philosophical background might hear something weird in the word perfection. The sense you used here is more the sense of completion,
exactly.
Right. It's not, he's not claiming, at least I don't think you are, Bishop, that the Neoplatonism within Western Christianity is beyond question, is free, absolutely free of error, or any other way you might hear the word perfection. I don't think you're saying that. I think you're saying, no. Yeah, right. You're saying it brought it to a kind of completion in important ways. And then, so I think that's fairly, you can unpack that a bit, but that's at least intuitively, once we get clear about how you're using perfection, that makes sense. But of course, transfiguration is a much different idea, and you're alluding to, I guess, in the Gospels where Jesus is transfigured before the disciples as sort of a template for understanding what transfiguration means to you, or am I imposing something on you?
Well, the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor is a core event and a core idea within the Orthodox spiritual tradition, specifically hesychasm and the debates of the 14th century, which centered on precisely the question that we're talking about right now. Mm-hmm. The hesychastic debates of the 14th century were a kind of confrontation between the Orthodox approach of God being beyond everything, beyond being, mm-hmm. And yet we can participate in him in a real way through his energies, mm-hmm. as opposed to the Roman Catholic idea or the scholastic idea, which was being proposed by, specifically there was the monk Balaam, and then there was others such as Aquinius and others who were promoting this idea. It was not directly with Roman Catholics. These were people within the Orthodox Church who had been influenced by scholastic ideas. The idea of God being entirely simple, the idea of the absolute simplicity of God, or what Thomas Aquinas calls the actus purus, the identity of all qualities and everything that can be said about God with the essence of God itself, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which leads to a propositional understanding of God as opposed to a participatory understanding of God. And that
Okay.
was the core of the argument.
Yeah. Can you
This,
yeah,
Mhm.
sorry for interrupting, but that's really,
Mhm.
I think that's really perspicacious and really pregnant. Could we slow down and really unpack that? Because of course you're also using language that I've been using to try and understand different kinds of knowing, propositional versus participatory. So that's so rich. And I know you want to go on because you have thoughts leading from that, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just, could you unpack that, just that really, like, because that to me is a profound, let me make a fairly bold statement. If you can make a good case for that, I could then see why Eastern Christianity has more resources for addressing the meaning crisis than Western Christianity, because part of the meaning crisis is the propositional tyranny and the lack of connection with participatory and perspectival knowing. So this is why I'm slowing you down, Bishop, is like, this is a pivot point. If you can make a really good case for this, then I think you've laid a really powerful foundation for other issues. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but if you could, like, what you just said there was so pregnant.
All right. Well, I'll try to address this. Although I also want to go backwards to the initial engagement, because it was the initial engagement of these.
Sure. Take your time. Take your time. Yeah.
All right. Well, if you'll allow me to take the slow route.
Yes, please.
Let me go back first to the initial engagement and what that transfiguration was, and then try to lead into the second part of the propositional versus the
Yep.
participatory.
Right.
So I think that that maybe we can break this down into three parts.
Excellent.
In other words, the transfiguration of Neoplatonism into three parts. The first part is something like a rejection of rationalism. And from the Orthodox point of view, ancient Greek philosophy, including Neoplatonism, are rationalist endeavors. And also from the Orthodox point of view, Roman Catholic scholasticism is a rationalist endeavor. It's a form of rationalism. And what that means is that in these two traditions of Neoplatonism and scholasticism, there is the idea that by use of the human reason, we can genuinely attain to truths, ultimately propositional truths about God, however you want to understand God. Now, that leads, I think, to the second issue, which is that because these endeavors are intellectual in nature, inevitably they restrict the access to those to the contemplation of God or to the participation in God. In other words, if you look at Neoplatonism, it's an intellectual endeavor. It's basically an elitist endeavor. The people who are, the famous Neoplatonist philosophers are all heavy intellectuals. Their mode of union with the one was, yes, part of it was purification of the soul, particularly with the idea of the rejection of matter, which is a key difference between Neoplatonism and Christianity, because Christianity explicitly values matter. But the other part was the idea of the contemplation. And so if you compare, for example, what was going on with Neoplatonism in the 2nd to the 6th centuries when it was flourishing, and what was happening simultaneously with Christianity, Christianity offers a vision of or a union with God which is accessible to everybody, not just to a small number of intellectuals. That was not the case in Neoplatonism. There was no popular Neoplatonism. Popular in Neoplatonism was simply, traditional paganism. There was a huge disconnect between the two in Neoplatonism, which did not exist at all in Christianity, because Christianity was and is a popular religion. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how educated you are, you can be a good Christian. And there are certainly many more Christian saints, most of whom are not particularly intellectual, than there are Neoplatonic sages. And the reason for that is because of the difference in approach. The Christian approach is participatory and non-rational, because we believe precisely that these things are beyond the reach of human reason. Now, that doesn't mean that human reason is useless. It doesn't mean that it serves no purpose. It certainly does serve a purpose. And there is always the option within Christianity for those people who are intellectually inclined to use that inclination as a tool towards ascending to God. So in no way do we deny that aspect of the faith. But fundamentally it's participatory. And insofar as it's participatory, it's accessible to everyone. So this is another key difference. And the third would be the transformation of metaphysics and ontology or theology. So we have in Neoplatonism there is the idea of emanation, and but there are a lot of metaphysical difficulties with the question of emanation, and there's also metaphysical difficulties with the question with the Neoplatonist union with the one, and how exactly that takes place, and what is the relationship of that with the contemplation. Those were not clarified in Neoplatonism. They were, you had one idea that was, the Platinian contemplation, and what Porphyrius says that during the time that they lived together, Plotinus was wrapped into union with the one 6 times, I think he says.
4, I believe, but it's okay.
Was it 4? All right. Well, whatever number it was, it's some number. The Christian view restructured the metaphysics. First of all, with the Trinity, and so there was a temptation within Christianity to transpose the Neoplatonist metaphysic onto the Christian terminology. That temptation was Arianism, because it's very easy. It's an easy mental shift to identify the one with God the Father, the nous or intellect with God the Son, and the world soul with the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
It's an easy connection, and that connection was being made by a lot of people in late antiquity, because it was a kind of bridge, a natural, easy bridge between Neoplatonism and Christianity.
Yes. Yeah.
But of course, the church condemned it. The church didn't accept that. It said that we have a totally different understanding, and it is a non-rational or supranatural approach, which is the Holy Trinity. If you think about the Holy Trinity, in rational terms, it doesn't make a lot of sense. you can't wrap your head around it. Well, I certainly can't wrap my head around it in rational terms. But if you accept that there is a non-rational approach to it, then it starts making a lot of sense. And specifically with respect to the Trinity, for example, the question of the one and the many.
Yes.
And the in of course, the question of the one and many is a perennial conundrum within philosophy. And you see some philosophers tending more towards the idea of the one, putting more weight on that, others towards the many, others trying to reconcile them in some way. The Trinity is the Christian answer to the problem of the one and the many. In other words, that both the one and the many are present in God.
But not side by side in any kind of logical conjunction. That's what I hear you saying,
no,
right? Right.
No. There's no way to make the logical conjunction. You can't make it fit logically. It has to fit in some other way. And
so can I ask you then? I get it that
mm-hmm.
this sort of defies, our conceptual logic, but I don't think you're saying that doesn't mean we can't come into some kind of contact with it, or else it could not be a truth for us. So is the contact? Is this where you're invoking the sense of participation? Is the participation where we can come into some kind of contact with the Trinity, so it can be true for us, even though we can't access it or articulate it through any kind of propositional maneuvers? Am I getting you right? Is that because I don't think you're evoking a kind of complete skepticism about the Trinity or anything like that, right? Right. So, am I on the right track, or am I far from?
No. You're on the right track. So this is where we get into a little bit of this essence energy distinction, and so that was another, and this is a key difference between the Eastern Fathers and the Scholastics, or actually going back to Augustine. The question of how do we participate in God, and what, when we use language about God, what are we actually saying? Mm-hmm. So Augustine and the Scholastics stated that God is a being. He is the greatest being that there is. And that we can understand him partly. The phrase that Augustine used was, we can understand him but not comprehend him. In other words, understand him partly. Aquinas then developed that more clearly with the idea of the analogia entis, the analogy of being.
Right.
But that's intellectual. All of that is intellectual.
Yes.
And so then when you ask, how would we participate in God in this set of concepts, the connection or the participation that we have in God and inevitably ends up being superficial. So the Eastern Fathers distinguished between the essence of God and the energies of God. In the Western tradition, starting with Augustine and then unpacked in greater detail by Aquinas and others, God's essence and his energy are identical. So there's only two things that exist. There's God and there's creation. Or rather, let me rephrase that. There is the essence of God, and then there is creation. So Augustine said that any sort of vision of God or manifestation of God in the world was a created being. It was a created effect. If it was created, that means that the participation was not truly in God, it was in some created intermediary. Mm-hmm. Where ultimately, where that led in scholasticism is with the idea of the beatific vision.
Yes, right.
In the beatific vision, you're not participating in the essence of God. That would be something like pantheism. Rather, you are viewing the perfection, the perfection of God, which in this concept is completely static, because all qualities of God are assimilated to his essence so that they are identical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the Eastern tradition, the Eastern Fathers made a distinction between the essence of God and the energy of God. The essence of God being what God is, the energies of God being what God does, but with the crucial understanding that the energies of God are in fact God himself interacting with the world. So what that means is that a person can participate in God in an actual concrete way that is not an intellectual contemplation of propositional truths, nor is it a mere interaction with some created intermediary between God and man, nor is it simply staring at the perfection of God. Rather, it is an actual participation in the life of God, such that the Eastern Fathers, so for example, St. Maximus the Confessor, say that we become by grace what God is by nature. Now we understand grace to be the energies of God.
So what's the relationship then? So I don't know how to phrase this correctly, but something like, how do you preserve the monotheism if the energies are not part of the essence of God? Because then I could hear a philosopher easily saying, well, doesn't that make the energies like accidental to God, non-essential to God, right? And therefore accidents are not taken. If I only participate in your accidents, I'm actually not really participating in you. So obviously there's a distinction here. Can you and you may just at some point, and it's legitimate for you to do so, you may say, no, this is ultimately something we can't get a conceptual grasp of. But I at least want to pose the question to you, like, so the traditional distinction, right, is between essence and accidents. And there's a new distinction being introduced here, if I understand you correctly, because the energies are not accidents, but they're also not the essence. So how are they neither the accidents nor the essence, but nevertheless preserve an identity relationship with God? Did that make sense as a question?
Well, not only does it make sense as a question, but it was explicitly addressed by St. Gregory Palamas, who was the saint in the 14th century who most thoroughly unpacks this whole issue. So he does state explicitly that the energies of God are neither essence nor are they accidents.
Right.
They are a different category altogether. And so there's a difference here between God and man, or God and creation, in which because of the absolute transcendence of God, in which God is not a being, he is not an essence, even though we use the word essence.
Yes.
But this is that goes back to the linguistic question, which I'll try to return to. And I apologize because I'm really garbling a lot.
No. I don't feel this at all, Bishop. I feel that this is going step by step, very, very carefully, and you're not making any. I mean, I try to intervene where I think there might have been too big of a jump, and you're not sort of relying on a tremendous amount of theological jargon, and so I think you're doing it very, very carefully, very, very step by step. So I'm finding this is flowing in a very linear fashion, in as much as it possibly could. So please continue.
Okay, so I guess to reframe it, the patristic the Eastern patristic concept of God is both more transcendent and more immanent.
Right, right. That's what I hear you saying.
Right. So of course, the idea that God is transcendent and God is immanent, that's a commonplace in most religions.
Yeah.
But then the question is, well, what's the mechanism for that? What does that mean when you try to break it down metaphysically?
Yeah. Yeah.
And practically.
Yeah.
So in the patristic tradition, God is both more transcendent in the sense that he is absolutely beyond being, beyond everything, beyond thought. St. Gregory, the theologian, says that, what does it say? Theon frasem en adinaton noishe de adinatoteron. It is impossible to express God and even more impossible to conceive of him.
This sounds like, if you'll forgive the pun, because it's not intended, this sounds like Orthodox Neoplatonism, that the one is beyond thought and even beyond being.
Yes, well, actually, I mean, Plato himself said that the one was beyond, or that the good was beyond being.
Yeah.
But Saint Gregory Palamas, Saint Gregory the theologian, who lived 1,000 years before Saint Gregory Palamas.
Yeah.
He actually took a phrase of Plato, in which Plato, I don't remember the exact phrase, but it was something like, it is difficult to speak about God.
Yes, yes.
And then he raised it up a level.
Right.
So, all right. So God is absolutely beyond everything.
That's right.
That's utter transcendence. We would say that, now that idea is expressed, everywhere in the Eastern Fathers. And there are justifications for it, which are given in some of the fathers, like Saint Gregory of Nyssa and Saint Gregory the theologian. They'll say things like, we can't even understand the created world. How on earth could we understand God, which is beyond the created world? And they give specific examples of that.
And there's also arguments that understanding is to to integrate things together and attribute them to their unifying cause. And that structure makes no sense to what must be ultimate reality, because it is not, there is nothing beyond it in terms of which, right, it can be explained, and it isn't divided against from some other that it has to be integrated with. So, you have those very powerful arguments that the fundamental structure of understanding can't apply to this. The source of intelligibility can't itself be in any sense intelligible. And I mean, these are arguments even in the Neoplatonic tradition. The question I want to ask you was, like,
and the grounding of reality can't just be more reality.
Yes. It's not, yes, I get it. It's not a quantitative extension. It has to be some significant qualitative difference. But what I just before I want to make sure if I'm getting the mapping right. So I understand why that doesn't actually technically fall under essence, because essence is a specification of properties that necessitate something being what it is. But are you using the word essence to point to the absolute transcendent aspect of God when you are using the distinction essence and energy? Is that what we're trying to do with that term? Is it trying to point to that the transconceptual, right, that we're talking about here?
Right. So this is where the difference in language comes in.
Right.
The scholastic tradition develops language in such a way so that language is actually describing God himself.
Yes.
It may be describing him by analogy. It may be describing him in a limited way.
But there's genuine content to the propositions such that it is legitimate to say the proposition is true because of that content, even though it's analogical. Right.
Precisely.
And that's what's getting locked into the propositional. Is that your point?
Right.
Okay, keep going.
Okay. So in the West, once you've identified the propositional with talk about God, and you state that this is true and this is false, that leads precisely to the propositional tyranny that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And in the Orthodox Church, we would argue, I don't think we can prove it, but I think we can indicate it, and it's plausible, that propositional tyranny led to some of what we would consider to be the distortions in the West, such as the Crusades and Inquisitions and so forth.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll take it. I'll take it on trust that there's at least a plausible account of that you could make. And I would say, if you give me the sort of an origin, there's a bad pun in there too. If you give me the origin of propositional tyranny, it would also coalesce with a lot of the historical argument I gave in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So
in the Eastern tradition,
right.
The question, since God is absolute, since He is ineffable, ineffable means you can't speak about it. What that means is that the language that we use about God is not ultimately propositional.
Right.
It is maybe something more like what you would call procedural.
Right.
In other words, the language that we use, and we use multiple levels of language, which St. Ignatius lays out very clearly in his mystical theology. The language that we use about God is more a way of orienting ourselves.
Right. So I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you about that because, a place where you can see language denuded of the propositional and just purely procedural perspectival is something like demonstrative reference. So when I say this or this, this doesn't carry any propositional content because it's just the act of properly orienting you towards something so that you come into some kind of perspectival contact with it, right? And of course, and then the argument within cog sci is that's a linguistic term, demonstrative reference, but there has to be something analogous to that that's primordial to attention, because attention has to be able to, first of all, tag things, this and this, before it can bring them together and then see if they have properties in common and make categories and concepts. So it's preconceptual, right? And it's pre-propositional, therefore. But what it is, it's a purely procedural orienting of your perspectival knowing, that sort of being here now with, it's at the core. And I know it, and I'm not trying to press you into saying, yes, that's exactly what it is. But is it language use that's like kind of for attentional demonstrative reference? It's designed to orient you and put you into a perspectival contact with. I'm reaching here, Bishop, because I'm trying to bridge from where I am to where you're talking. And I acknowledge that it won't probably fully land, but is it close? Is it a good way?
No, you're very much on the right track.
Right.
That is how we understand these things. Now, I want to
because if that's true, just hold your thought. If that's true, it already gets me deeper understanding of, because when you do that, the procedural for the sake of the perspectival, you're very close to for the sake of the participatory, right?
And that's where it's all supposed to lead.
Yeah, right. Okay,
right.
please continue.
So we use it as a map. This is I don't know if that's a good term, but it's an image that's maybe useful to orient our lives towards God, to conceive of God in some way that is useful for that orientation.
Yes.
And also useful for the way that we can structure our thoughts about the world, right, about reality.
So that proper orientation, if we can continue the metaphor, but it's not that much of a metaphor, given for ecog sci, that orientation affords navigation.
Precisely. Yes,
right.
Absolutely. With the purpose, there's a purpose behind it, which is participation, the participation yes. in God, which in and of itself occurs on multiple different levels. And Saint Dionysius explains some of these levels. Or there's we can say that the Dionysian framework has become the classical framework in Orthodoxy. And to be fair, it's used quite a bit in Roman Catholicism. The idea of purification, illumination, and deification.
Aquinas is deeply influenced by Dionysius.
Right.
He cites Dionysius more than he cites Aristotle.
But see, Aquinas fundamentally misunderstood one of Dionysius's core ideas.
Please.
Dionysius talks about God as hyperousios, which is translated into Latin as super-essential. But Aquinas understood hyperousios, super-essential, as being something like super-duper essence. Whereas Dionysius, the Eastern Fathers, understood hyperousios as being entirely beyond the concept of essence. So you see the difference, and there's a linguistic misunderstanding there, which ultimately becomes a conceptual misunderstanding.
So when you're invoking your essence energies distinction, I have to understand essence in that demonstrative reference sense. It's orienting me to something that is actually supra essential. Is that correct? Am I? Yes.
Yes, correct.
And then what is conveyed by the energies in the distinction, and why are they not accidents?
Okay, so we understand that God being super essential, and absolutely transcendent beyond everything, there has to be, at least according to Christian doctrine, a means of connecting with God, of participating in God. And so the question naturally would be raised is, if God is so absolutely beyond everything, how on earth could you have any connection with him at all? Exactly.
Which a question that arose within Neoplatonism.
It did arise within Neoplatonism. I think it was not very adequately answered.
Fair enough. But so what I'm saying is the question, I think the question does naturally arise the way you say it does.
So the Orthodox answer, or the patristic answer, was that we interact with God through his energies. And when we say energies, of course, we understand this also on multiple levels. And sometimes there's word games, or there's semantic confusion about the way that we use energy, about whether it's referring to a created effect of the energy. But there is fundamentally a category of God which is participable.
Yeah, right. Participative.
Participative. All right, we'll use participative. And that is himself God in his actions, or God in his grace. And the fathers talk about that on a couple of different levels. If we talk about grace, for example, we can use the word grace, and it refers to an effect. In other words, it can refer to an emotive state. If a person is in church and they feel compunction or contrition, or they have tears, they might say, I experienced grace. But ultimately, that's a created effect. It's an emotion within the human person. And I would say that a lot of the scholastic or Roman Catholic talk about grace is precisely on that level.
So like a gift that is transferred, kind of thing, to the person, right?
But it's an effect, a created effect. I mean, tears are a physical object.
So it's more something like the sense of gratitude for the gift, if I can, because I'm trying to play with the notion of grace as gift. Right?
Well, it can be. I mean, it can be all sorts of things. Any sort of, let's say, positive emotion in a religious context can be understood as grace. We can use the word grace to refer to it. In fact, most Christians do use the word grace to refer to something like that.
But I hear that you want to say there's a deeper sense.
There is a deeper sense, which cannot be accessed by the scholastic definition of grace, precisely because they have excluded any further
Because they only have the two categories, essence and creation, right?
There's nothing.
Okay.
There's
Wait,
nothing
I just
else
want to make
there.
sure I'm getting this. This is all clearly coherent for you. It's just coming to me. So I just want, so I'm going back to your earlier argument. They have a hard distinction between essence and creation. And so the grace has to be understood basically just as the creative effect. But you have a notion of energies that is neither just, right, the effects nor the essence, but the participatory aspect of God. I know aspect's the wrong word, but no word is right, right? And then that puts us into a deeper understanding of grace, because we have a category that's not just the created effect, but also
Yes.
Am I getting it? Am I following the argument?
Yes,
Right?
no, you're definitely getting it.
Okay.
Yeah, you're
Okay.
definitely getting it. So, okay, so this is, if we view this on the, let's say in the Dionysian framework, purification, illumination, deification, there's grace on all three of those levels, or we can say there's interaction with the energies of God in all three of those levels, but they're very different. If we're talking about on the level of purification, which hopefully all Christians are trying to purify themselves, most likely the way that we're going to experience grace is by those created effects.
Right.
Now, which are good in and of themselves. I'm not saying that to downplay
No.
their importance in Christian life. Of course, we need to have these emotional experiences. I'm not saying that we should constantly be in a stressed emotional state, or that's unbearable. But there has to be an emotional component to our religious life. Otherwise, it doesn't become
Authentic. I mean, it's not
authentic. It's dry.
Yeah.
So, all right. But then, if we go to the level of illumination, and this can intersect with your work on a number of different levels.
Yeah.
We use the word illumination, and there is a little bit of, let's say, I don't want to say overlap, let's say commonality with the Eastern word enlightenment. It's not identical. I don't want to say that those two are identical, but there is a little bit of commonality.
They do share commonalities, and they seem to come not from the domain of action or inference, but more from something like what happens to us in insight, where we participate in a process by which reality is disclosed to us because we've moved beyond a way in which we've been framing. I mean, this is Plato's ascent out of the cave, kind of the anagage thing.
Yes, and it connects with what you say about flow.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So when a person is in a state of illumination, they receive divine grace, which is active within them, and it is God Himself within them. It's not a created intermediary, nor is it an emotional effect which can be at least partly reduced to chemicals and synapses within the brain. Not that I'm saying that that's the totality of human emotions, but
No,
that aspect exists, which is created and physical. It's something else. It's a level of grace which comes down to us and in which we participate. Saint Gregory Palamas says that since the word grace means gift, that advent of God within us is such that the gift of grace that God gives to us becomes our own. It becomes part of us. And in fact, we believe that this is what we were created for, which is a distinction from from the scholastic view of grace as the donum superaditum that Aquinas talks about, of this being, how can you say, of nature and grace being distinct, and grace being something that's super added onto the nature. For us, the nature, the true proper state of human nature is precisely to be imbued with grace and to be living in grace.
So it becomes a proper part of us. But I also heard you say that energy affording that transcendence, that sense of what I'm doing with my hands, right? But you also said that is God. That's not just an effect of God.
Yes, it is God. So some people use the phrase "the presence of God," which is true, although vague and insufficient.
Yeah.
The word that the fathers use is synergy.
Right.
Which means that there is the human element, which is our own person experience, and the fathers do state that this is primarily mediated through the nous.
Yeah, that part of us, that the noesis, that part of us that can move to different ontological levels through kind of a systemic insight. That I mean, that's what it means in Greek.
Right, and it's very important in the fathers is the distinction between logos and nous. These are two key ideas. Saint Maximus deliberately juxtaposes them, and he deliberately explicitly talks about them as how the two could be unified. And in patristic thinking, the model of unity, or the model of unity of all dualities, is precisely the union of the two natures in Christ.
Right.
Which is a whole another.
I don't want to get off on the incarnation yet.
I don't want to.
I just want to make a note. So the word used is synergy, and then I know Erasmus and Luther. Erasmus is trying to propose a kind of synergy in sanctification, salvation, and Luther explicitly rejects it. He explicitly rejects that. So I imagine you see Protestantism is very, very far from the position you're arguing for then, because of that. That's so there couldn't be.
Unfortunately.
Right.
Because they're missing out on some of the best things. And that's connected with the Protestant idea of vicarious justification, or vicarious righteousness, that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us vicariously. Mm-hmm. That's a really horrible idea from an Orthodox point of view, because we don't want to be vicariously righteous, we want to be actually righteous.
I get it, and I don't want to launch into a criticism of Protestantism.
Yeah, no,
but I just want to make clear, because I see, I'm not saying Luther was a nominalist, but you've got the nominalists and right coming in, and then you get Luther's rejections of synergism, and all of those things are really enhancing propositional tyranny in the West. I would argue, sola scriptura, and it takes precedence over sacrament even, is an indication of that. Now, again, I'm really not here, and I know you're not, because you've said this to me. We're not here to sort of say that that Protestants aren't true Christians or whatever. I don't want to get into that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not telling you what you should do, but I don't want to do that. I'm just trying to understand. And the reason why I brought up Protestantism is because it became the dominant form of Christianity in the two great superpowers, England and the United States. So it has a kind of world grasping provenance. And therefore, that's why I was bringing it up, to try and say, the fact that gets projected onto the world by these two superpowers may, in fact, be part of what I call the meaning crisis. That was the only reason why I wanted to make that connection. I'm not here to try and, whip Protestantism in any way. I just wanted to get that point out, if that's okay with you.
And we would entirely agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, the Orthodox would entirely agree with that. So the state of illumination is a state of participation in God, not simply on the created emotional level.
No, but there's actual synergy. There's actual interpenetration of some kind. I know all these words are heretical, but I'm just using them to try and get.
Those are not heretical words. Those are the words that we use.
Okay, so now I'm wondering here, again, and if this doesn't land, that's fine. And I've got to go in about 5 minutes. So right now, before I forget, I'm inviting you. We'll bring it to a sort of a logical pause, and then you're going to come on again, please, and we're going to continue this because I think this is really, I'm really getting the argument of how Eastern Orthodoxy has resources for addressing the meaning crisis that are not available in sort of the Western legacy of Christianity, if I can put it that way. I'm getting this argument. You seem to be telling me that I'm getting it, and I feel like I'm getting it.
No, you are getting it.
So I just want to try and map, and so this is where it may verge on being heretical. So we've got synergy, we've got interpenetration, but I'm trying to think phenomenologically. So when I sort of get an understanding of transcendence, I talk about this sense of moreness, that there's more in the sense beyond whatever framing I have of it. There's more, and the ultimate moreness would be, that which makes any kind of intelligibility itself possible, and it's ineffable because of that, because of its super transcendence. But I also talk about suchness, and this is influenced from the Buddhist tradition, which is something that is so radically immanent that it's not categorizable, right? It's not a property of a class. It's unique and specific. So for you, there is, but ultimately for any object, but it's good to do it with people because they get a sense of that. There is something that is unique about you. There's a unique suchness. There's an aspect of you that is non-categorical, that is you, and that's all I can do. I can just keep pointing at it with those words and emphasizing it. And it's kind of the way in which you are radically immanent in yourself. And I'm wondering, is that the place where the synergy occurs? Like, if the synergy, what I'm trying to say, and I hope this is consistent with the argument, if the synergy is just in your categorical properties, right? That strikes me as, I don't know what I want to say. It doesn't seem to be something that would put me back into a state of an orientation to something that's finally ineffable. But like, there's the ineffability of, right? There's different kinds of ineffability. There's an ineffability in that I can't get, right? It's so beyond my conceptual abilities because it transcends them. Like you said, super essential. But there's also there's the deep ineffability of what vanilla ice cream tastes like to you, right? I can't.
Yeah, well, there's the qualia.
Yeah, but I'm just the qualia. I'm not identifying it with the qualia, but I'm identifying it with, right? There is something that you uniquely point to, and this is also, so just like I did a demonstrative reference, I can do a demonstrative reference I. And my I and your I can't be the same, because then I'm not using the word I correctly. Is that where the synergy penetrates to?
Well, there's both aspects, I think. There's, the fathers talk about this distinction between person and nature.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
So we use the word hypostases.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about Christ, we talk about the hypostatic union in Christ.
Oh, I see.
And of course, Christ is our model, right? Now the distinction between our union with God and Christ's union with God is that for Christ it was an essential union, because he is by nature, by essence, both God and man. Right. Now, for us, we don't become by essence God. We become by grace God, or by energy God. And so the union is on a personal level. It is on the hypostatic level, but the energy is interpenetrating our being.
I
So
get it.
there's both the person and the nature.
But and I've got to go in literally 2 minutes, but I'm trying to get this idea, like when people talk about these experiences of deep participation, they often use metaphors that have different directionalities. One will be an out and up and beyond, right? And then there's within, beneath, like the depths of my soul kind of thing, where they, and I'm trying to map that onto what you're talking about here, because I'm trying to, like, so is are the energies sort of experiencing the radical immanence of God? In fact, with the most immanent aspect of who we are to ourselves, we are experiencing the immanence of God. Is that the energies?
Well, yes, because we become the person that we're supposed to be.
Right. I get it. Right. Okay. So yeah. So it is sort of your superlative suchness that's in relation to this, right?
See, the fathers use both of those terminologies.
Yeah.
They say, they say explicitly that you are becoming one with yourself. You are uniting with yourself.
Yes.
And there's the whole idea of the integration of the fragmentation of the human personality, which we all suffer from.
Right.
This is a core idea in the Hesychast, for example.
So there's a synergy within the psyche, if you'll allow me that, and then that psyche is also in a synergistic relationship with God. But those two synergies are like one with each other in some important ways.
They're one with each other because that is what we are supposed to be. So if we say that God's grace is active within us, we are both saying that we are in a relationship with God, with the transcendent, and we're saying that we are becoming or experiencing what is truly our proper nature.
Right. That's what I was asking for.
Our proper self, and the two are identical.
Right. Okay, Bishop, we got to stop right there. That's a nice crescendo, at least, to stop on. It's nowhere near completion. I'm inviting you to come back fairly soon, and we'll get another one of these. We'll just pick up this conversation right where we're at and keep going. I feel there's a lot more you want to say. You didn't properly get into theosis yet, and I wanted to hear what that is and how that
was the next level.
And how that difference from the Western Christian conception of salvation. Obviously, there's significant overlaps, or you wouldn't both consider yourselves Christians. But what are the significant differences? And again, every time you make one of these moves, in addition to getting it, I'm trying to see its relevance to the potential for responding to the meaning crisis. So I invite you to come back, and we'll keep doing that together. But I
thank you very much for having me on, and it was a great conversation. I apologize for jumping all over the place.
No, it's okay.
And not presenting these ideas in an orderly fashion. And part of the reason for that is that everything is related to everything.
I get it. I get it, and that's the same in my thinking too. With making this dynamical system into a linear algebra is often you can feel how it's misrepresenting things in some important way. I get it. I really appreciate that. I really thank you for this conversation, and I look forward to you coming back and we talking again.
All right, thank you, John. God be with you. And we'll
thank you so much, Bishop. I really appreciate this a lot. You're really helping me to understand a lot. And there's ways in which I've been ignorant. I mean, I'm reading a lot of this stuff. I'm reading Dionysius. I'm reading Maximus. I'm reading because I'm trying to understand this. And you're helping tremendously. Thank you very much.
Well, you're helping me too. And it's a mutual benefit and a mutual blessing.
Excellent. That's what we want.